last time we were together, we talked about the elder and his work. We talked about things like stewardship and various other things. But since then, I've gotten the responses from the question about being able to, what did it mean to be able to teach. I have some material to go over about teaching before that, and then we'll look at, it's just a summary, it's not everybody's individual response. I shared one of those with you back when it was snowing, and I hope you got a chance to, but what I'm going to put on the screen is a little bit different than that. So, here we go. Elders must be capable teachers, and 1 Timothy 3:2 says they must be able to teach. The Greek word means apt and skillful in teaching, and I said I was going to try not to dwell on Greek words and acknowledging someone's preference for not doing that, but just an interesting point, we do get our word didactic from that, which didactic is a word in English that deals with teaching. Most other translations say something like an able teacher. Apt to teach is the old King James way of saying it, and that's probably what you hear said most often. A good teacher, a skilled teacher, a gift for teaching, or skilled in teaching. And one who is able both to teach true doctrine and to refute false teachings. And we're gonna dig a little bit more into that as a sort of a separate category after we've gone over the teaching part. Okay, so we'll come back to that. So, the acquisition of knowledge and the ability to refute error is not something that happens overnight. I think you would all agree with that. And I think you would all agree, if you've ever done any teaching or training in your own career where you've had someone new come in, you would, I think, agree that if you had worked one day in your career and then the very next day they said, okay, you have somebody to train, you're going to be like, well, I've been here one day. I haven't had time to learn myself. So it is definitely not a thing that happens overnight. Okay? It is not merely an intellectual exercise, but involves a skillful handling of the truth, and that requires time, repetition, and a familiarity that is almost second nature. Okay, we're going to discuss here in a few minutes about what the actual process of teaching is, but good teaching, well, I'll save that for them. Aptness to teach means not merely a natural aptitude, that's part of it, but the qualification of having been taught as well. And that does not necessarily mean in a formal setting, but you've put in the work to learn and to grow your own base of knowledge. In a classroom in a public school, that's one of the things you're evaluated on is your knowledge of your content and your ability to deliver that content in a way that students can understand it and interact with it. So the teacher in a public school is expected to have the knowledge, but also to be able to impart the knowledge to the students on whatever learning level they might happen to be on. And that would carry across to the Bible setting as well. False doctrines are often complex and are camouflaged by elements of truth. How many of you have ever heard the acronym TULIP before? Okay. TULIP is an acronym that summarizes the teachings of a false doctrine. Pretty complex, okay? So it's not something you can kind of just handle off the top of your head or by the seat of your pants, okay? It takes a seasoned and trained intellect that understands the nuances of false teaching and is able to marshal accurate passages and concepts to answer it. And this is a big one, and why we're doing it. Teaching is not an optional part of serving as an elder. It is an essential element. Last time we were together, we talked about, and I showed you the picture of Jesus holding back the wolves while he had a lamb under his arm. The way an elder does that most often is through teaching, right? I don't think anyone is going to show up violently at the door, all right, and need to be restrained. Because it's happened a couple of times. Happened to my brother-in-law, and then it was a policeman in the congregation, not an elder, that stepped in to handle that. So that's why it's so critical. That is how an elder, that is one of his primary tools, if not the primary tool for shepherding, is the ability to teach. Okay? I'm going to just kind of talk for a while unless y'all interrupt me. All right? And so much of the elder's influence upon the congregation involves teaching. Teaching to edify, teaching to exhort, teaching to correct, whatever the particular type of teaching that might need to be done. Let me come close.
It's how parents discipline their children largely. It's through teaching. That's a lot of what discipline means. Is
if you discipline well, yes. Right. If you just wail on your kid and send them in the corner with no words or instruction, and they have no clue what they just got a spanking for, no teaching happened, right? Punishment happened, but teaching.
The word discipline, you can see the word disciple in the word discipline.
Right. All right, so naturally that's going to require you to have good communication skills, okay? And this is important also. One need not be particularly eloquent or formally trained in pedagogy, but an elder must possess a degree of articulation that makes the truth plain and clear. Okay, I've used this example before, but it's been a while. If you've ever done any study of what's called the Restoration movement, which was back in the 17 and 1800s here in the United States, one of the most prolific preachers of that era was a guy they called Raccoon John Smith. Okay, and if you ever read anything about Raccoon John Smith, someone like the prophet Amos might come to your mind. He was just a country fella, had no formal education, and most of his preaching, he would just go out and stand up on a stump where a tree had been cut, but he converted many people, and no formal, he had studied the Bible, right, and was largely self-taught. So, you don't have to be formally trained in pedagogy to be able to do it, okay? But it does take self-discipline and a commitment of your own self to study and increase your own knowledge. That's why I was resistant as a young person for a while. I got all this pressure. Well, you need to go to this Christian college or that Christian college, or you'll never be as good. And I'm a pretty laid back person, but that just made me more determined to not go, right? When they told me I could not be as good as somebody else if I didn't go. Okay, and it's not required, neither in here. Not saying the skill is not required, but the official formal training is not required. All right, so we've gotten to the response summaries that you guys submitted. It'll show the question at the top, and then sort of a categorization of the different answers. So the first question in that was, please explain what you believe is involved in the ability to teach. All right, there were several responses regarding clear communication and preparation, which we've touched on. But the summary of those statements was that teaching involves explaining concepts effectively, often supported by scriptural references. Okay, and Titus 1:9 and 2 Timothy 4:2 are both passages of scriptures that would support that kind of statement. All right. The teacher also, there are some thoughts regarding adaptability and motivation. Teachers must adapt to the audience, okay, and maintain a willingness to teach both formally and informally. Teachers have to adapt to the audience, okay? So if Leslie got up here and started giving one of her presentations that she gives to her colleagues, right, and people with her level of training, we'd all, our eyes would gloss over pretty quick. Now, could she adapt it to us? Yeah, I ask her questions a lot, and she dumbs it down for me, right? So you have to, and again, in formal education settings, that's called differentiation, right? You say something to a student one way, and the blank look on their face doesn't go away, right? So you have to find another way to try to present the concept. Different example, different wording, whatever the situation might require.
Paul's example on Mars Hill versus how he talked to Jewish audiences is good.
Okay. Yeah, he did sort of an object lesson, I guess we might call that, by using the statue to the unknown God. Whereas if he was talking to the Pharisees, the council, it would be a different sort of conversation.
Well, when he talks about becoming as a Jew to the Jews, becoming as a Greek to the Greek, that's the same idea. That's a big part of what that meant, was meeting people where they were, guide them towards where they need to be.
Right.
Scott, one other example is Paul's frustration with the Corinthians of having to speak to them as children when he should be able to speak to them as adults.
Okay.
Not being able to give them meat because they still need milk.
Okay.
So he's recognizing the need for differentiation, but he's not able to do that because they just keep staying on this lower level.
And it depends again. You have to know your audience and their interests, to be able to do that well. Of course, biblical grounding came up often, and we would expect that. Okay. Some emphasize that teaching should be based on sound biblical truth without personal bias. So there are things in the scriptures that are clear cut, right? We believe, for example, that baptism is a clear cut teaching, that the scriptures clearly explain it as being necessary for your salvation. But something like the women's head covering is not, right? So that would be an example. If I stood up here and told you that the women just simply had to wear a head covering, or they were not honoring God or pleasing God, that would be personal bias coming into my teaching. Teaching by example. Several responses noted that teaching extends beyond formal settings to everyday interactions and personal conduct. And I agree with that. We all teach in ways that we may not even realize that we're teaching. However, that cannot be the only way that an elder or someone that would be an elder, that cannot be the only way that they're able to teach.
Just on the previous thing, it's impossible for us to escape personal bias. It just is impossible. But I think that James has something to say about that, talking about looking into the law of liberty, and Paul talks about, examining yourself to find if you're in the faith. I think that it's incumbent upon those who teach to engage in reflection and examination and consideration, so that they at least have the possibility to grapple with what may be their own personal bias versus their cultural baggage. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but a good teacher is going to do that work on their own to try to accurately, as best they can, gauge where they're coming from and what they might need to change and where they might be weak.
Right. And that did not necessarily show up in the comments, but that is a good point. That a Bible teacher needs to be reflective on their practice. They need to, and it's a little bit harder in a public school setting. You teach a concept, you give some kind of assessment to see, right? If everyone bombs the assessment, you say, whoop, I guess I need to find another way to present that, right? And you keep adjusting until you get a better idea that the majority of your students have caught on. Giving tests is not, is not really associated with this. There would be nothing wrong with it, in my opinion. So it's a little bit harder for the Bible class teacher to measure the success of their teaching or whether they're getting their message across. Because most of the time it's just, people sitting here quietly and taking in information. Did you have a?
Yeah, just to tag on with what Jeremy said, and to use the example about the head covering, a lot of people who wear head coverings don't think it's a matter of personal bias.
Right.
They do that out of a sense of conviction that is the truth. And in recognizing that in other people, we need to recognize that in ourselves as well and hold a tentative view to things. Even the things we hold most sacred and most true, we need to constantly, you mentioned baptism, bring it back in front of yourself and examine your understanding of that, and sift it and sort it, looking for your own personal biases in that matter. It is, there are things that I feel that I prefer, and then there are things that maybe I believe are absolutely true that really is being tinted or tainted by my personal bias.
Okay.
And you don't know what it is, so you have to constantly examine everything. So if you recognize personal bias in someone else, you need to be willing to look at it for yourself as best you can.
Right.
And that's why we need other people to kind of call us out on those things.
It's extremely important to recognize your own limitations and respect
Yeah.
them in terms of your understanding.
I don't know. But I'll find out. Should be like sitting right here in your pocket or something, ready to pull that out. So as far as reflecting on your teaching, I mean, typically in this setting, if I'm getting engagement and discussion, then to me, that's an indication, okay, I'm presenting this in a way that people are understanding, or at least understanding enough to ask some refining questions. But if I'm sitting here and talking and everyone just kind of staring at me, as I continue to talk, I might say to myself, why is no one saying anything? Am I too much up in the clouds? Do I need to come back down closer to the ground? Sort of thing. So maybe I'll whip out a test just to shake things up in some way. All right, what are the indicators that someone is a good teacher was the next question. Again, communication skills, clear and engaging delivery, often adapted for different audiences. Okay? And I guess when we talk about the elder's ability to teach, I guess we primarily first shift our focus to teaching adults, because especially in their role as shepherds and defenders, holding fast to what is the faithful word, an 8-year-old is not going to come in and start delivering false teaching, at least not on purpose, right? So when we say things like this, we kind of shift our thinking toward different adult audiences. And as was already pointed out, even your adult audiences are not all going to be at the same place. Approachability and respect. Good teachers are open to questions and foster a supportive environment. Okay. There's a professor at a college that I attended. I did not have him. I'm glad that I did not. Now, I have no doubt that this professor knows his source material. But as a student in your class, and I only know this from people that I know that had him for a class, you were not allowed to ask questions. I mean, he'd lock the door when time to start class, and then he would start talking. And when the 55 minutes or whatever the class length was up, then he unlocked the door and you left. Okay? That would have irritated me as a student because I was a non-traditional student. I'm thinking, dude, I'm paying you, and if I have a question, I'm paying you to answer my question. But that's just me. So, I don't know. He kept his job for a long time, so, and apparently I don't know what his reviews must have looked like, but I don't know. That's just not a style of teaching that flies very well with me. Preparedness, of course, is huge. Effective teachers are well prepared and knowledgeable about their subject matter. And you can tell, right? You can tell whether the teacher is ready to teach or not. Clarity and validity, the ability to present teachings in a way that resonates with and is understood by students. Okay? And this applies to a Bible class as well. You guys probably remember when you were young and in elementary school, maybe you were embarrassed to ask questions. You didn't want any attention directed at you. You didn't want your classmates to think that you were somehow less than them mentally, or So you may have been reluctant to ask. I told my students all the time that smart people ask questions. That's how they get smart. I would say it daily and many times a day. Okay, and it's no different in here. Okay, if you don't understand something, there's probably somebody else in the room that may be struggling with understanding it as well. So we're helping each other out. If something was not clear, and you raise your hand and say, I didn't understand that. You're helping yourself, you're helping probably someone else as well. The indicators of successful teaching: student engagement. I just covered this pretty much. Participation, asking questions, contributing to discussions are signs of effective teaching. Again, if you're just sitting here not saying anything, I can't tell whether what I'm saying is making sense or not. Jeremy?
There was one that I thought was important that I didn't see on the list. It's the idea of the relevance of the teaching. That discernment that the teacher would have to deliver the content that is most necessary. I could stand up, I don't know, maybe David could do it and teach in detail about the stones in the ephod or something like that in great detail and depth, but that's not terribly relevant to what most people are dealing with and is most necessary for them to hear.
Right. Or some lesson on numerology in the Bible. There are some people and some religious groups that really, every number in the Bible means something, But I remember teaching one time when Jesus had told them to let down the nets, and it mentioned specifically they caught 153 fish. There are people that would dig into that and say 153, and it's like it says 153 fish because that's how many fish they caught, and that's all it is. It's just they counted the fish. Comprehension and application. Successful teaching results in students understanding and applying what they learn. When am I ever going to use this, right? That's a famous phrase from school days. I hope what we talk about in here, you find occasion to use all the time. Preparation, organization, again, well-prepared lessons grounded in Scripture. Those things lead to success. Is everyone a good student? Okay. There was a discussion in the answers about personal readiness. Some students may not be receptive due to various factors. Okay? And, you know, a babe in Christ is probably not ready to get into a detailed discussion about everything that the book of Revelation means, right? They're just not really ready. I mean, they might participate in it and do their best, but they're just not really, may not be ready for that. So if you ask them a bunch of questions in the study of the book of Revelation, they may come across as not a good student, but it's simply a matter of not being there yet, okay? And then the goal of sowing seeds, and this is our primary goal as teachers of Bible things. The teacher models good learning. Not all students will engage equally, okay? It's our job to throw out the seeds, right? It's our job to throw out the seeds. We cannot force the seed to grow. Is a teacher completely responsible for the failure of a poor student? I put this question in there because someone who is now an elder himself told me in a class that I was teaching that it was 100% my fault if a student didn't understand something. It was all the teacher's fault. Okay. Fortunately, from my vantage point in the front, I could see the jaws drop open of everyone else as they heard him say that, okay, because they recognize that that is not a valid statement. There is a shared responsibility. Students have free will and must take responsibility for their learning. Again, that question gets in the way in regular education. When am I ever going to use this, right? How many of you remember saying that at least to yourself, and then later in life realize that you did in fact use that information? We could all probably say that, right? We could all probably say that.
Scott,
Yes.
if I could bring up Romans 10,
Okay.
and it says, felt that he had reached no one. You know, he says, Lord, who hath believed our report? You know, we're talking to one of the great prophets of God. And if you're just measuring the quality of the teaching and by the metric of how many people follow it, he was a terrible teacher, at least from his own perspective. Of course, his perspective was very, very limited, and that reminds him of that.
How many of you seen those stories on social media posted, even if the particular story was a work of fiction, it is grounded in reality, of a teacher encountering a, quote, difficult student much later in life, and that difficult student said, "You saved me," right? I shared one not all that long ago about an older retired teacher who was about to be operated on by a student she taught, a bad student that she taught. And he was about to operate on her and save her life. And he had given her a letter anonymously, and he was sitting in the room. He had his mask on, so she didn't recognize him at first. And he had written her this letter and basically just told her how she had saved his life, literally. And of course, she was very emotional. And then he pulled down the mask, and you know, it'd make you cry even if you're not a crier. It was pretty moving. So you're right. We don't know, right? We don't know the effect of our teaching. It may be years before someone says, you know, I remember when brother so-and-so said this in a Bible class, and I didn't think anything of it at the time, right? So there we go. We just said all that. Does all teaching happen in a formal setting? No. There are individual interactions, conversations, daily life examples, and the passages that we've looked at in this study indicate very clearly that an elder is supposed to be teaching by example every day of his life, but all Christians are. And it was suggested that the message remain consistent in formal and informal settings. I had an encounter in one place we worshiped that they had 3 elders. We had been in a discussion about something that was going on. When the 3 elders discussed it together, they made a particular decision. But when another member of the congregation talked to one elder just by himself, he said something different. And basically the defense was, well, basically he said, our messages don't have to align. Like, well, yeah, they do, right? I mean, if you're going to say this to me in private, then you need to be willing to say it to the other members of the eldership and be consistent in your messaging. You don't say one thing when you're together in an elders and deacons meeting and then say something else to somebody on the phone later. The different ways that teaching might manifest itself, of course, formal settings like these, informal ways, you could come up with your own list, probably. And of course, modern tools. We have a lot of tools at our disposal as teachers that teachers of old did not have, and we could use them effectively. Then some general thoughts from the survey that were really not easily categorized. There is a skill difference between preaching and teaching. Preaching and teaching are not the same skill. They can overlap, but they are not. And here's why I say that. There are many guys that preach, and when they do, and let me just say at the beginning, I'm not knocking this at all. It's a method, and I think it is taught in some formal classes for preaching, the manuscript method of preparing your sermon. That means you're writing your sermon out word for word, okay? It takes thought and preparation and study to be able to do that, okay? But you're just going to repeat what you wrote down. That is not the same as in a room like this where you're saying things and people are asking you questions about what you said, or going down the little rabbit trails and things like that. Picking on Leslie again for a second, she could probably write one of her presentations out word for word and hand it to me. I could stand in front of a group of her colleagues and read that to them, right? But if they start asking me questions, right, then the game is up, right? My inability, I'll be exposed as a fraud in that case. So, just because a man can stand in front of a group of people for 30 minutes or so and deliver a sermon, that is not the same skill as standing in a classroom, being able to interact with students.
Would that be the medical equivalent of speaking in tongues?
Yeah, probably so. Probably so. Okay? So, and that kind of leads into the next point. If you want to be an elder, the congregation needs to see you teaching. Not just preaching, but teaching, right? Teaching, interacting with people. Because we're going to move on here to a second about faithfully defending the word. And that's exactly what you're going to be doing. And that is not typically done in a preaching setting. Any comments or anything on that? Right?
I often think about the word training when I think about teaching. Is that involved in this? I think of training as like a hands-on teaching type thing. Would that be a way that that word is?
Yeah, I think training involves more of a, putting your hands on the thing and doing it rather than just sort of talking about it.
Yeah. I think of Proverbs where it says train up a child, and to me that's a totally different meaning than teach a child. And I don't know if that applies here, but I've always thought that that's a really good way of me learning something is for somebody to show me, train me.
Why I think it goes back to what Jeremy said earlier about that. You know, you have to show the child, you know, and sometimes that requires a hands-on, and you got to get it done. I remember one time, I didn't get a lot of spankings as a kid, but like any of you, I got more than I thought I should, right? But I remember one time, here was the deal. I was out on this, we lived in a neighborhood, one of the few rare times in my childhood we lived in an actual neighborhood. And I was out in the street with some other kids, and there was a stop sign right there at the end of the street. And I had a slingshot. I thought the stop sign would make a good target for the slingshot. So I fired a rock. I don't know if it ricocheted. I don't know what it did. But a neighbor's house was right there, and I hit the neighbor's window and broke the neighbor's window. Right? So I had a consequence for that, and I had to get up early on the Saturday morning. I was hoeing out this hedge thing that we had in the backyard. And my dad was not liking the way that I was hoeing. And he wasn't real patient all the time, but you know, he'd show me, and then I'd do it wrong again, and he'd do, and I'd do it wrong. So I finally got a spanking because he thought I was just being belligerent, you know. But I promise, the last time he showed me, after the spanking, he showed me differently. And then I understood what the goal was, because I was reaching to the far side and hoeing the weeds back over on top of the weeds that had not been hoed up yet. He was trying to get me to understand that I needed to start at the close side, so I'm not covering up weeds, you know. But I promise he did not make that clear so that was some training that went awry, and I remember that.
Well, I'm a drama teacher. My daughter wanted to try out for a play. So I taught her what she needed to do. I gave my little spiel I would give a student, all right? And then she got up and did it very wrong. So that's when the training came in. And so, okay, reminding what I had taught, and then, okay, now try, okay, we still didn't quite get it. Coaching, the back, the forth, the demonstration, okay, do you realize you're doing it? So that's that hands-on back and forth work that I think is the difference between training and just delivering a message.
Right. And I think teaching in here involves both of those, which was kind of the goal of like that how do we do the things we do out in the worship service class that we had a while back. All right. So we don't really, I mentioned this earlier, you know, formal education is how you give some kind of assessment and you would decide whether learning has taken place. It's a little bit harder in here, right? But, you know, we just did like 3 Sundays on alcohol. And if I did those 3 Sundays and then I went and found one of you, you know, 3 sheets to the wind in a local bar, I would think to myself, my teaching must not have been very good on that subject. So now here's an important question. Do elders teach by extension? In other words, are the elders responsible for the content taught in every classroom and for the skill of the teacher? I have my own answer to that question that I will keep to myself for the time being. Jeremy?
I'd say no, but indirectly it leans a little bit more toward yes, because Paul talks to the Ephesian elders about ravening wolves that are going to come into the fold, and some even from among you. And so the idea is, yeah, it's not like it's coming from the elders. Someone is teaching something incorrect in the classroom, but their job is to kind of have an idea of what's going on, and if something is out of step or out of place, to deal with it.
Okay. Ashton?
Yeah, the instruction for elders is, you know, feed the sheep, shepherd the flock. So you have to be aware of what's going on in terms of everybody's service towards the flock and the congregation. So you need to keep a finger on the pulse of that. And then it's clear that elders are not the only ones teaching. You have teachers, that's one of the parts of the body. So there's some delegation that takes place, but responsibility is on the elders to lead that.
Okay.
Yeah, just to tag on to the responsibility part, there's a big difference between micromanaging something and giving freedom and empowerment to the teachers that you have in those classes. If you give them empowerment in terms of how they're going to teach, sometimes what they're going to teach, then you're also training them, going back to the train up the child, you're training them to become perhaps more suitable for greater use in the kingdom. For the men, that might be where they gain the skills to become elders or deacons one day.
Lisa used to tell me, she started teaching as a young teenage girl. She's on a regular basis, an elder would come and sit in for a little while on the classroom just to keep in that. I think that it's important because we all understand how hierarchies work. And while this hierarchy is a little bit different from a secular one, it is still a hierarchy, right? And elders shoulder more responsibility than most. All right. I might be able to get through. That's the end of the survey. So we mentioned this a few times. Holding fast the faithful word is why they have to be good. And remember, earlier I mentioned that the elder had to receive teaching himself, and that's what Titus said there, as he has been taught. Means to hold firmly, cling or adhere to be devoted. He must have a firm grasp of the word. They must stick to the true message they were taught, a strong grip on the truly reliable message, or standing by the message that can be relied on. I'm not going to read all of this, just the parts in red. Those who presume to lead must embrace the traditional teachings. And I kind of don't like the word traditional because it carries a bad connotation sometimes, but basically he means the teachings which came through Christ and the apostles. Leaders must not come from among those who flirt with new doctrines. Dedication to the true gospel message would qualify them to encourage others by sound doctrine. And secondly, knowledge and adherence to sound doctrine will equip a person to refute those who oppose it. All right, elders must be able to exhort, encourage, or build others up. And there are some various translations, all basically mean the same thing. And both of those with the goal to convict those who contradict. All right, correction, reproof, or censures. Other translations, I think our English word refute probably carries the best idea of what we're talking about with this concept. Okay, and Titus went on to say it a little bit later. He said there are insubordinate, idle talkers, deceivers, whose mouths must be stopped because they subvert whole households, teaching things what they ought not for the sake, and that's the elder's job. As Barney Fife would say, nip it, nip it, nip it, right? Nip it. And here's important though. The Greek verb suggests an educative dimension. The goal of the refutation of false teaching is not to destroy the opponent, but rather to restore him to sound doctrine. You're not trying to win an argument. You're not just trying to crush your opposition. You're trying to point out their error and lead them back onto the path. Okay, and that's the end. So here's, next week we're going to do a sort of a, I called it, for lack of a better word, applying the standards. Okay, we're going to start considering now, we've covered all the standards, we've covered all the qualifications. We're going to talk next week about some things that might come up in thinking about those. And then we'll, if that lesson fits into one lesson, then the one after that, we'll talk about the actual appointing process. What does the Bible say about who does that and how it is done?